So now, last time I vaguely remember we were some kind of come to some kind of a chapter ending again, but I had the feeling that there were all kinds of questions in the cases and all kinds of issues that were left hanging. So this time in particular, I would like some beginning response to what we were doing last time, or of course it's always open to reactions to earlier material or to issues that you see need to be discussed, either concerning the analysis of the self, the psychology of the self, or other topics in psychoanalysis, clinical and theoretical. So I hope very much that you cooperate by verbal response, and not just by passive waiting for me to steer you.
Well, last time we described the parts of the establishment of the self as occurring by the breaches in empathy, the disintegration, and outbursts of aggression or experiences of aggression. What other ways does the self become established other than breaches in empathy?
Okay, now let's go to this side.
My experience of last time was that we began to take a look at aggression as a disintegration product when there was failure, when these breaches indeed did occur. It seemed to me, we left off at a point which was still one that I'm interested in pursuing further, and that is, in what way those patterns of aggression are expressed, let's say, in the masochistic aspects of character, and then what becomes the focus of intervention. How can we help? So that aspect feels like it's still, and even the overt aggressive and sadistic elements of a person's expression, anything. The approach to them.
Okay. My question may be related to Dr. Kohut's feelings on important part of the establishment of the self. What is the role of consciousness and the unconscious in establishing the self with respect?
What were you?
Jones.
What did we really talk about last time? I think I somehow recall what you read something some more, but
Well, some more in terms of my own question. You've spoken about aggression, and you had compared the idea of a primary drive of aggression by comparison to your idea, which was more of a reactive phenomenon to breaches of empathy. I had wondered where it was that pleasure
fit into this. Word was that not aggression, but sexuality or libido, depending on how you want to talk about it, fit into this. As part of what goes on in the establishment.
Any further speakers ready? Well, I would think the best way of tackling these issues, say there are many points to which I don't have any really good answers at the moment. But let's start perhaps with the most general issue. The question that Dr. Fajardo mentioned at the end, and Dr. Lipkin mentioned as part of his wishes for discussion earlier, namely the relationship between drive psychology and self-psychology. It is not correct to say, for instance, as you seem to have, I know you said it in a very abbreviated form, particularly Dr. Lipkin did, concentrated form, but in this form it would certainly not be correct, a correct rendition of my views that I consider aggression as a reaction phenomenon and not as a drive. I consider it as both. These are two theories on two different levels, but it is not, they are not in contrast to each other. The propensity toward aggressive responses is a congenital or inherited given. And there is no question about it that even from the psychological point of view, aggressive phenomena have drive quality. One feels driven by aggression, or at least there are aggressive states in which we feel driven by aggression. However, this aspect of aggression is psychologically important only in two quite widely apart, located phenomena that are located quite widely apart. Namely, in very early forms of aggressive outbursts, it would seem to me, in which we are dealing, at least we might be dealing, this is very difficult to be certain about. I'll come back to that problem later and remind me if I forget. But very early in life, we might say that a self-psychology would be prematurely applied. At least we have very little evidence, perhaps. Again, I will discuss this in some detail later on again. But offhand, let's say, we might say that very early in life, we come closest to seeing drive phenomena, both in terms of libidinal urges as well as in terms of aggressive outbursts. Now, the real issue is this, I'm not interested really in these biologizing forms of psychology, but it would seem to me, though this is not one of my major interests, that there is even in these earliest times some evidence of a difference between the libidinal appetites of the baby and the aggression. The libidinal appetites do arise, as it were, spontaneously. The child gets hungry when left alone. However, it would seem to me that from the beginning, aggressive responses, although clearly resting on an inborn faculty, as I said, the child is the propensity of aggressive expression, does not in the same way arise spontaneously, but arises from the beginning in response to the disappointments and frustrations of what he wants. In other words, I don't think that one can say that from the psychobiological point of view, that aggression is quite parallel from the beginning to, let us say, a libidinal force that drives the child to seek sources of satisfaction. He doesn't seek sources for aggression in that same spontaneous way. There are, from the beginning, it would seem to me, intensities that accompany the wish for the libidinal satisfaction. And only if the libidinal satisfaction is not forthcoming, or prolongedly not forthcoming, in other words, really in the beginning, what breaks in empathy or in empathic response, only then does destructive rage supervene, or something that may be a precursor of destructive rage in the baby. That seems to me rather evident, although, as I said, it's this kind of psychobiology isn't anything that I am tremendously interested in. Be it as it may, I have no objection, and actually more from the psychological and empathic reconstruction side, to talk about aggression as a drive. There is clearly a driven quality, as I said, in the impulsions of aggression once it has been set into motion, regardless of how it has been triggered. Once there is a frustration of this type present, this kind of drive, this kind of push, this kind of inner moving in a certain direction is clearly there, and in that sense, quite parallel as an inner experience, which one can be empathic even in the small child. In that sense, quite similar, let us say, to libidinal urges. On the other end of that spectrum, in the phenomenon of chronic narcissistic rage that I described in my paper on narcissistic rage, I think there it is, although we're dealing here with highly complex psychological states, There one gets again the impression of drivenness, of a reaction once begun that keeps on going and follows its own extra and supra-personal and supra-individual ways and directions. So there too, I have the impression that even from the psychological side, the expression and the concept of drive is quite an appropriate one. Now, this is obviously is a long ways from some kind of a drive that needs to express itself. And I would think that in the sense of mastery and greater control, the real question comes about whether the simple conceptualization of the building up of defenses, substitutions, sublimations, of aim inhibition, things of that kind, deal with the aggressive urges, drives, impulsions in the most sensible way. Unquestionably, this kind of a conceptualization of the subduing of a drive, the rider and the horse, has its place. It has its place, undoubtedly, in the acculturation of children. The delays that have to be instituted. Even though frustrated, one mustn't immediately rage. That there are other means of expressing one's anger, of expressing one's insistence. So the issue in early acculturation of handling the drive aspects of the aggressive propensity of man make a degree of sense and have to be instituted. And the same is true in terms of the psychoanalytic situation or later adult states, that as a emergency measure, as an overall attitude, let us say, in chronic states of anger, this type of confrontation may occasionally have its place. I have the impression that the error is all on the side of overdoing that. And that is why I'm particularly stressing the other. I think that while very occasionally there is a place for that, generally our patients know that anyway. Generally, they do not have to be told once more that it is better not to rage. Generally, when that is done, it is an avoidance of the essentials, and it endangers the analytic situation to drift toward an avoidance of the essential analytic task with regard to the aggressive component in the picture, rather than a help. And why? Because it does indeed take its effect if transference establishes itself. Then the prohibitive, inhibitive aspects of the relationship can very well silently be adapted by the patient. The aggressive phenomena disappear and become subdued to the detriment of the analysis of the totality of the complex of which the aggression is only a part. So this is a question that has to be weighed in each individual instance. But what I'm trying to show you here is that the concept of drive versus defense is intimately connected with specific therapeutic and analytic strategies, or tactics rather. It should be tactically I accept it, strategically I do not. In other words, the total strategy, the overall approach to the patient, is not the simple, almost all cases that I'm familiar with, it's not the simple learning of how to subdue the aggression. It does not rest on unconscious aggressions being made conscious and therefore becoming available to mastery. This is tactically occasionally the case, but usually not. Usually the aggressions are not handled in psychoanalysis primarily by the patients being exposed to them and then gradually learning how to handle them. But usually the aggressions in the major part of the analytic work become a part of the total narcissistic matrix, of the total responsiveness to narcissistic vulnerability, of the total responsiveness to the problem of the special sensitivity toward narcissistic injury, and particularly toward a non-empathic environment. Then the aggressive propensity subsides as part of the greater grasp of the total picture of the disturbance in the narcissistic sector of the persona. In that sense, of course, I would say, clinically speaking, then, or also theoretically speaking, aggression is then not viewed primarily as a drive that has to be tamed, but as a reaction of as a part of a total picture of narcissistic imbalance. In other words, there's only one factor in a much more complex psychological disturbance. Now, as I said before, both in the realm of aggressions and even more strikingly in the realm of the libidinal drives, the question of the relevance of what kind of a psychology, or the question of what kind of psychology is most relevant is the issue, not whether aggression and libido are drives. What particular model is the most helpful one? Not only in terms of successful therapy, although that is part of it, but in terms of a sophisticated and broad understanding of the phenomenon. Now, it's very interesting that, as you know, drive psychology as I just tried to explain to you, and the connection with the discussion of aggression is also true for the libidinal drives. Drive psychology is most apropos in on two opposite ends of the spectrum, for very different reasons. It is most apropos in early states. Again, remember that I said there's a footnote to that I wrote. I'm keeping in abeyance because I don't want to confuse the issue. But in earliest life, or in regressive states, in which the conditions of earliest mental life are repeated, it would seem to me that it is self-evident that the inorganic
chemistry of a drive psychology will be most easily applicable, simply because the complexity of the psychological conditions is not yet so great, and in particular because we may assume that a self is not yet present, or if it is present in very rudimentary form. So that we are, at that particular time, when we are looking over such primitive stages, I'm saying this all still with a little question, to which I will come back. That in these primitive stages, even of early development of serious regressions, drive psychology will in many ways fill the bill. The expression of drives and the rudimentary beginning of opposition to the drives. Drive and defense. Both when no self has been formed, or when in regressive states a self has been so seriously destroyed that we again seem to be dealing with drives and drive expression that is purely to be handled, as I said, with the inorganic chemistry of drive psychology. We see a drive, unbridled aggressions, unbridled wishes of some kind, of a libidinal nature, and can see primitive defenses establishing themselves against such primitive defenses as turning against the self, for example. Now, of course, when we say turning against self, we do not speak in this particular instance of a self in the terms of self-psychology, turning against, switching directions, taking the opposite directions, which would be the more correct description. Because it is all within the concepts of a drive psychology, not always the psychology of the self. Now, on the opposite end of the scale, and this is extremely important now, what I'm going to say, I think, on the opposite end of the scale, I think it should give you great pause and it should all be good reason to puzzle. Why it has been possible to conceptualize in a reasonably satisfactory way. Nothing is ever in science totally satisfactory, but I think we must say that we are objective about it. It's hard for us to be as analysts, steeped in the learning of these scientific systems. But I would think that if one does not look upon classical psychoanalytic theory with a jaundiced eye, so many modern analytic psychologists are doing, I'm not one of them, that I would say that the simple drive defense model and the more sophisticated outgrowth of the drive and defense model, namely the tripartite model of the mind, or the structural model of the mind. I know that sounds crazy at the moment because usually you hear them as the opposites, but from this broader perspective, I take the one to be an elaboration of the other. Whether you see something as drive and defense, or whether you see organized functional units like the ego in opposition, stable opposition to each other, it is still built up essentially on a drive psychology. ego psychology, in that sense, still belongs to a psychology of the drive. It is not a self-psychology. Now, the question that I'm raising is, why is it possible, or how is it possible, that in the most complex psychological states of later childhood, namely, for instance, take the complexity of the psyche of an Oedipal child, with such complex goals and such complex discernment of various figures in their environment, and a great variety of subtle experiences in feeling tone, and what have you, this enormously complex psychic situation. How come that the simple drive and defense mind, the simple, comparatively simple, inorganic yet model of the structural model of the mind, how come it was so satisfactory? How come it has remained essentially satisfactory insofar as concerns those reactivations of these late stages in childhood, in which the self is, of course, present and enormously participant, as, for example, in the classical psychoneurosis? How come, the structural model has served us so well? Just the opposite end of the spectrum from these very primitive states of drive and primitive defense. I think I know the answer. The answer was essentially given a long, long time ago, although nothing about the application of this, by Anna Freud, in the ego and the mechanisms of defense. If you reread the first chapter, she said that the contents of mental structures do not in general really translate, impinge on awareness, unless the structures find conflict. And I think an elaboration of this particular dictum is equally true for the applicability of the psychology of the self. Again, I have footnotes and I've taken a number of things back that I say, but in gross outline, there is that we are not aware and not really terribly interested in a self that is firmly and soundly established. That we notice it only, that it becomes important to us only. That a psychology of the self becomes imperative only when we are not dealing with states of the self in balance, but with states of a disturbance in the self. Therefore, par excellence, a psychology of the self becomes imperative when we are discussing the narcissistic personality disorders, in which the disintegration, the fragmentation, the hyper and hypocathexis of the self are the center of the psychopathology. If we wanted to be exact, and I would say again, there are footnotes that believe that it will not hurt to include the psychology of the self, even where it has up to now not been necessary, and even where we have been doing very well without it. I still think it will be enriching even there. But secondarily, it is not imperative. In the transference neurosis, in the Oedipal child, of course, if you wanted to be exact, it never is a drive against a defense. It never is an incestuous drive against castration anxiety. It is always a total self having the aspiration to sleep with the mother and to kill the father, and that experiences the anxiety of the threat or the loss of the love or whatever it may be. The only thing is, if you allow me a mathematical example, since it is present on both sides of the equation, you can cross it off, and the equation still comes out right. So the point that I have in mind is that a psychology of the self had to arise from the examination of states and of developmental phases in which the self is insecurely established. It will not primarily become imperative. It will not primarily be noticed, and it was not primarily instituted into psychoanalysis, leaving out now other issues. I'm not talking about theories that are formed ex cathedra. I'm not talking about theories that somebody cooks up the idea a self would be a good thing to have in psychoanalytic theory. I'm talking about theories the way psychoanalytic theory ought to grow, namely generalizations and abstractions that relate to empirical phenomena. These empirical phenomena available to introspection and empathy, our mode of observation, became imperative, as it were, and forced themselves upon us when we dealt with the area of development in which the self was insecurely established, began to establish itself, had swings of a rudimentary presence and the destruction again, the backs and forth, and the same kind of issues when they happen in psychopathological states that are replicas of them. However, a psychology of the self will not, become imperative, was not to be found in states in which even very early in life a self is only so rudimentary that it is not yet to be noticed, or in regressive states in which it has almost completely disappeared again. Let us say when you are overwhelmed by a drive, some instances of a paranoia in that sector of the paranoid's personality in which you pursue certain aggressive aims, grudges of that particular type, and in states in which the self, as self, is not threatened in its construction, as a structure, as a configuration, even though it may experience, greatest anxiety and or be totally devoted to its pleasure or aggressive aims, as in the Oedipal situation, and in the reactivated replicas of it that are, as you know, partially unconscious in the transference groups. Now, only yes, sir.
But even in cases in which a narcissistic disturbance does not seem to be at the forefront of the issues that bring attention to analysis, there would seem to be a period during the working phase, a consolidation of the gains of analysis, in which the self would seem to establish itself in a much more obvious way to the observer, to the analyst. So that there does not necessarily be a conflict as such to bring about the issue about the narcissistic development of that particular individual, that is the establishment of the self. But even in cases in which primarily there is a drive formulation of the issues in that particular analysis, there would seem to be an establishment of the self. There would seem to be an organizational process that touches upon the narcissistic realm?
Well, it's an interesting issue that you're raising here. I think, one would have to speak about specific cases and specific types of cases to really evaluate your point. I have been, on the whole, these are always, how should I say, old issues of temporary preference for particular times, particular periods in one's own work, in one's own insight that can be dropped again. But I have been inclined to stress, rather the opposite of what you say, even though I don't dispute it. That is, I've been inclined to stress that people in whom drive defense conflicts may be very incapacitating, yet simultaneously, a firmly put together self can be quite inevitable. You find creative people racked by neurotic conflicts. You find people with firm personalities, even though they're suffering from severe symptoms. So I've been inclined to stress the other. Nevertheless, I will not dispute that there are individuals in which, if I understand you right, toward the end of a properly worked through transference neurosis, the personality seems richer. The personality seems more vital, more active. But, I say it differently from the way you say. Because in the reconstruction or in the translation into my terminology of what you said now, I don't think that a self has formed, if this is indeed such a pure case, of an undisturbed self, but a self that suffers, a personality that suffers from a serious structural conflict. I think more fuel is now at the disposal of this self. It is not that the self has become firm. Now, in some ways, I seem to be speaking against what you said. But in other ways, these footnotes that I was talking about, that I was going to add later on, are very much in tune with what you say. You see, what I have really said up to now, I have not made propaganda for discarding the psychology of the self when we are dealing with the structural neurosis. I've only tried to explain why it was possible and why it remains possible to deal with the essentials of the psychoanalytic process without any direct and conscious focusing on the vicissitudes of the self, which has not been done and is not being done by most analysts. And yet, one can achieve theoretical and then secondarily clinical mastery over these conditions on the basis of concepts that do not include the self, at least not as a conscious, theoretically formulated concept, regardless of how intuitively, people might address themselves to it anyway. But I would subscribe, I think that is what you have in mind. Maybe you, if I misunderstand what you have in mind, then maybe you can explain more clearly what it is that you were driving at. Other than that, I personally do not say that now that we have become, or are becoming more sophisticated with regard to the self, and its constituents, and its aspirations, that we should continue to disregard, even in the even though we can do without it, I think we can do better with it. And I think the same is true as we scrutinize even those earliest stages of infancy and even those very regressive stages in which the self seems to be totally destroyed. While we can do without it there, while the primitive model, the inorganic model of drive and defense serves the purpose, I think we will be more sophisticated about it if we recognize that rudimentary forms of the self are present even then. And one of the most important issues in all this lies in the, for me, not completely solved observation, importance of the fact that one can see that parents relate to very small children as if they had itself, even though our attempt, to empathically reconstruct such a self in a very small child would tell us probably not. Now, it may very well be that it is the dovetailing of the beginnings, the rudimentary beginnings of a self, and the self that the fantasy of the loving, empathic parent already imagines to be there in the child, that this is the most healthy matrix for the growth of the self. To grow into something that is already there in the mind and of the beholder, with whom, after all, one is in empathic close. So that as the social and psychobiological observer would say, the symbiotic relationship, between mother and child. In other words, it's a different framework, not a depth psychological framework. If the symbiotic relationship is the precursor in that sense of what for the child and for the child's experience is originally not a self in himself, but the self that the parent sees in him, but that he, by including himself into the parent, in the earliest narcissistic nerves, experiences first via the empathic anticipatory responses of the mother or the father. But those are things that need to be examined in greater detail. They're, to my mind, quite open to empirical investigation, not only in empathic child observation, but very much also in the psychoanalytic situation, when the expectation of the analyst, the in-tuneness of the analyst for the potentials of the patient, not verbally expressed, but at least not debunked and belittled in its earliest moves forward, play a very great role, most overtly in hindering progress and silently in not hindering it. Over and over again do I see in myself and in others how subtle belittling of the setting aside of the analytic task and the superseding of the analytic task by now the assertion of creative progress in the individual. How that, when one asserts one's analytic narcissism and says, this doesn't interest me, I want to analyze, this is a resistance, how you can see the regression then in the establishment of the self, and this is an extremely important thing to keep in mind. It falls into this whole area of the preoccupation with parts at times when the self as a whole presents itself. And it is a break in empathy in the analyst, then to apply the drive and defense model at the time when this is not the issue, but when the issue is a newly formed cohesion of the self that now shows itself cautiously and tentatively and wants a response. As you know, I'm not a corrective emotional experience artist. I do not think that a response needs to be given. But the issue that needs to be clearly stated is to show to the patient empathically, this is what you want at this particular moment. And not say, this is a resistance, let's go back to your drives and your defenses. Then you slap him as he moves forward, and you misunderstand what is in here in the analysis at that particular moment. So, both in the primitive states and in the later states of development, where up to now the drive and defense model and the structure of the tripartite models stood us in such good stead, the addition of a self-psychology, secondarily applied, will be very enriching, and once we have learned to integrate this aspect of our theory smoothly with the other one, will not lead us in following, some hot air issues versus the nitty-gritty of the threatening drives, but will add substance, it would seem to me, to the way in which we phrase our interpretations, to the subtleties in which we show how the drive aspirations conflict with a defensively postured self and things of that particular type. It will, in other words, in these states of greater psychological development, lead us in a theoretically well-grounded way, not to be too abstract in our interpretations, not to be distant in our interpretations. In other words, we will do something theoretically well-founded that analysts, of course, have intuitively handled. Good analysts, of course, have intuitively handled all along appropriately. But in that sense, as I said, the psychology of the self may not be imperative, but it will be helpful. As an interesting aside, it's something that I haven't really thought through yet very much. I think this is also a protection against all the errors that come from the simple application of the conviction that man is an animal. Of course man is an animal. We don't need to fight in ourselves any battles against thinking that man was individually created by God when he had done everything else at the peak of creation. But this type of pre-scientific narcissism, was handled by Darwin. But the fact remains that while it is a good thing to see the similarity, it is also a good thing to see the difference. Then we can go back again and see new similarities on a higher level. There are differences. I think animal psychology is much more appropriately, on the whole, handled on the basis of a drive and defense model, of domestication, of taming of instincts, for example. The difference lies, I would think, that in animal psychology, the individual self of the animal is of lesser importance than in man. Or at any rate, it seems to me to be less elaborated in man. Why? Because of the enormous importance. You see, there's a variation of the old dictum of the prolonged dependency of infancy, and therefore the latency period. I think the self of the individual also becomes so enormously broadly and varied, because from the beginning there is this complex relationship with an empathic or unempathic human environment. And the complexity of this matrix, the self forms in a very specific way, enormously influenced by the specifically present human environment. Now, I do not, to take back again some of the differentiation, I do not believe that rudimentary selves are not present in animals. I would think, for example, that such issues as we can observe, particularly in domesticated animals, as pride in the self. You know, when you praise a dog, you know, you can see the chest comes out, the muscles tense, the tail goes up. You know, you can see that the prideful increase in self-esteem that comes from the echoing that the dog has received. And there's undoubtedly it's a very, very interesting, by the way, that the tail goes up, the anti-gravity aspects of self-esteem, which is, I think, very closely related to the standing up proudly of man. I'm not thinking primarily here of the erection of the penis. I think those are secondary issues that concern then the penis. I think the upright position of man in space, the importance of the eye, the pridefulness of showing the chest. I think even in the primates, when the primates are proud, they are standing on 2 feet and then begin to hit their chest and drum against their chest, not on all fours. So the lifting up against gravity, and therefore I think the signal, symbolic importance of the flying fantasy in showing the primary forms of the grandiose self. All this, I think, seems to me are fascinating connections and well worth pursuing a variety of words. Well, where have I gone? I've flown. You know, I have really not answered any one of those questions directly. And I will try to go back to the details, but I think I've cut through all of them, and I've answered a little bit of all of them. Because I think in all the issues that you raised here, the question of the drive, the drive as a disintegration product, drive psychology versus self-psychology, you know, all this needs to be first clarified before one can attempt now to approach the details that you maybe have brought up here. But before I go to them now, let me rest for a minute and let's see what your response is to what I have so far said. Try to tackle some of these more detailed questions. Yes, Dr.
Well, in terms of my
talk along so that I can have my last.
In terms of my question, it seems to me that you've elaborated that it isn't only breaches in empathy would contribute to the establishment of the self. There are conflicts that occur that do not involve breaches in empathy. But in terms of the way you put it, the phenomena of the conflict itself is part of what contributes to the establishment the self. A conflict, in fact, is not only an inescapable, but maybe even a necessary phenomena with regards to the establishment of the self.
Yeah. Well, I think that's very, very true and very good. There's no question that a preformed capacity, for the development of the self is there. Nothing can ever be explained simply on the basis of environmental and educational influences. You can see these only in terms of enhancing and hindering. The drives are innate. Freud finally came around and said certain ego functions are innate propensities, at least in Nietzsche. And now we can also add to it that the capacity for the formation of a self, of seeing oneself, of experiencing oneself as a unity in space and as a continuum along the time axis, that these are innate givens, the propensity for it at least. And then we observe the interaction with the environment, that optimal frustration that leads to the best results. The point is not that the self develops because of breaches in empathy, but that the limitation of the self out of its more primitive stages, out of its merger stages, is enhanced by optimal breaches of empathy, the optimal failures of the empathic response, by optimal shortcomings that are being discovered in the idealized imago. Then these are qualities that become part of the self as an independent configuration. But the tendency to form this is there anyway. Aggression, by the way, plays, I think, a particular role there, because the self as a center of initiative and as a center of aggressive power is clearly something that contributes to the sense of being a unit that is a nucleus of power, of assertiveness, that one wants something, that one experiences something that is also, of course, centrally related to the self. And as Dr. Jones implied in his earlier questions, the experiencing self is an aspect of the self. But I think a healthy self is not only an experiencing self. It also has aspirations, it has ambitions, and it has ideals. In other words, it is pushed and it is pulled, as I said at one time, to the dismay of people who were so worried about anthropomorphism and psychoanalytic theory. But these are similars, obviously. Now, aggression in that sense is important because it contributes very much, effective aggression, to the sense of the self. However, the disintegrated forms of near pure drive aggression happens when the self is destroyed. Then you have the fragments of utter destructiveness that do not seem to be attached to anything anymore, and certainly do not seem to emanate anymore from a self that experiences itself as having had a history and will have a future. The importance of history, by the way, for nations, for groups of people, should also be looked upon from this point. You know, of course, I'm talking about a group self in analogy to an individual self. But history, although it has up to now served mainly falsifying grandiose purposes, and in that sense was rather destructive, must become a scientific history that is a scientific objective history
will serve an understanding of the cohesion of the group self, and as such may make the group assertive but not destructive, more assertive but less destructive. We hope. Now, there's another point to your question, Dr. Fajardo, namely the role of aggression and the role of breaches in empathy with the attendant aggression at the periphery of the self. I just talked about aggression now at the center of the self. In other words, that the self sees itself as a source, as an initiator of aggression, assertiveness, of effective action, let's put it that way, in the service of libidinal aims, which also are part of it, or in the service of narcissistic goals, let's say ambitions or ideals. But the self also has a border, and it is right at the border, at the moment of separating itself from a merger self, of being part, included into the idealizing other, for example. Take, for example, a very simple empirical empathic fact, that a child is being unempathically carried. So long as he's empathically carried, he's part of the merged big one. He sees himself, as a fragment. Fragment is poor. As an integrated part of the bigger whole that carries him. Lying fantasy fulfilled. But comes the unempathy turning around the corner, that lets the head flop or hits the head or something like that. Rage supervenes. And this is now rage that delimits. You did this to me. In this particular moment, the anger at not being carried empathically sets up optimally a rage attack and a separation at the border. Now, if there's total lack of empathy, never caring properly, then the self is destroyed, of course, because it needs to free itself from a satisfactory merger self-experience, and then gradually, shift the focus of these earlier experiences to an independent self. This has to be done gradually via the limit setting or limit increasing or delimiting, not limit setting, the delimiting, you understand? Limit setting in a different way. The delimiting cathexis of aggression at the border between the merged and the non. Okay, I'm crossing 1 hour. Victim aggression, disintegration, masochism. I really don't know how to approach this in a general way. Theoretically, like all perversions, there are 2 types of perversions. Those conceptualizable on the basis of structural conflicts, and those conceptualizable on the basis of self-pathology. Never mind that there are intermediate forms, of course, and one begins to clarify, one acts as if pure forms exist. Now, masochism, I really want to put this in a nutshell for you. Conceptualize on the model of the structural model of the mind of drives and defenses, relates to incestuous aggressions
unconscious, incestuous aggressions or edible aggressions. I can say incestuous, edible. And structural conflict leading to the result of self-defeat, of self-injury, of self-hurt, essentially built and understandable within the simple drive and defense model of the mind, as sophisticatedly enlarged by the introduction of the superego. The superego there is then nothing but an enormously elaborated new form, and a new step in the ego, as Freud originally said. In other words, it belongs to the total defensive system, but in an organized form. In these instances, ideally at least, there is no serious self-pathology. Masochistic perversions, I'm talking about the perversions now, the non-sexual manifestations would have to be variations of these nitty-gritty, again, units of psychopathology that I'm outlining. The masochistic form of perversion, however, would be something totally different. The masochistic form of perversion that are an outgrowth of self-pathology has nothing to do with a structural conflict, but as something that is related to the fact that a disintegrating self inflicts any strong situation on itself that will give it the feeling of being alive. In other words, pain is vastly preferable to deadness. In a nutshell, this would be the issue. There are many forms of masochistic behavior, from the head banging of the child, the lonely child, the non-empathically responding child. I do not believe that this is the manifestation of a death instinct that wants to do away with itself. I do not believe that it is only aggression turned against itself, or primarily so. No doubt, these phenomena do occur. Aggression turned against itself. It does occur. But I think those are the milder disturbances. So long as there is aggression, so long there is hope that finally the non-empathic environment will come around. And it is in the setting of this hope still existing that is of a not really totally disappointing empathic environment, that structural conflicts or precursors of structural conflicts about one's aggressive aims, the aggressive wish or the aggressively asserted wish will arise. You may then have precursors of the type of masochistic phenomena that I described in the first example. But once the child has become depressed and lethargic, the head banging and the self-hurting, self-injuring behavior is not anymore to be interpreted in terms of guilt and guilt not motivated. Then it is to be interpreted. I think it will open a great deal of new understanding for you if you see that in watching your adult patient. Then it is to interpret it much more in the terms of self-stimulation, independent of traumatic purpose. the searing wounds, the hurts, the cold, are no different from any other forced activity in the attempt to feel something which is better than the horror of feeling nothing. It is therefore, to my mind, psychologically not the expression of a decadence, but much rather the ultimate last resort of the psychological wish to feel alive.
Why are not pleasures maybe indulged?
They are, side by side. Much of the infantile sexuality, not all, but much of the infantile sexuality is looked upon in the models of the pure classical drive psychology as the expression of primary wishes that have to be tamed, are in reality depressive equivalents, an attempt to feel alive, the prolonged, joyless masturbation of children, the prolonged, joyless oral activities of children, the prolonged, eternal moving back and forth of the fetal mass in the anus, are not because it's so nice and one doesn't want to give up the cane. They are disintegration products because the unempathic environment has not confirmed itself in the anal phase, in the oral phase, and in the phallic phase. So that those are not the primary drives that need to be tamed. And when they are reactivated in the analytic situation, the model of taming the drive and defense model does not apply for these. Now, how many perversions and masochistic attitudes, for all perversions, are in fact due to this one, and how many due to the other, that I leave out. I frankly and in honesty have hardly seen one, and I've sat long enough with them, that has been built up on the drive and defense model. But it doesn't mean that they cannot exist. I have not seen them, but I get a select group of patients, and I think on the whole, the underlying depression and the underlying fear of lethargy, the underlying fear of deadness are much greater motivators in perverse behavior and in the sticking to infantile pleasure aims, whether they are now masochistic hurt pleasure or a drive pleasure. And perhaps here you have the answer why the term pleasure includes masochism. The old puzzle, why is masochistic pain pleasurable? Is it really pleasurable? Or is it the pleasure of feeling alive?
Perhaps for the next time.
Write it down.
Okay.
Don't urge me for 2 weeks. Write it down and then you can get your
The relationship between the experience and self and psychological